We start this afternoon with high tension between so-called allies. Well, Turkey's foreign minister is threatening to kick the United States out of a key air base if the Trump administration moves ahead with sanctions. Now, the NATO ally has been criticized by Washington for a military operation in Syria's north and plans to buy a Russian-made defense system. Now, according to reports, this was sparked by the news that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is debating a bill to penalize Turkey's energy and financial industries. Adding fuel to all this tension, this base is home to a number of U.S. nuclear weapons, as we have covered here on the show in the past. But we need to go further in depth, and we bring in former Pentagon official Michael Maloof on this. Michael, this just is coming across, and obviously there's been added tension, building tensions, but this is actually going to be something that the Turkey's now looking into. The U.S. military maintains about 50 nuclear gravity bombs on a base within Turkey. If the Turkish government takes control of these bases, what happens to the troops on those bases, but also these nuclear bombs?
Well, first of all, the sanctions have to pass in order for the Turks to take action. They have threatened to take action. If that happens, a number of things will happen. Number one, Turkey has threatened to take back bases. The nuclear weapons that are there, they're tactical weapons. They'll probably be moved out, and the U.S. will have to look for alternative locations for bases. Now, they've been doing this. They've been scouting around. They've invested a lot of money in refurbishing a base in Jordan, and they're thinking from a strategic standpoint to move their forces more toward Greece, which will offer another conflict between the Turkish.
What about
Greece.
Poland in that? Because I've heard Poland they've also have some possibility.
Well, that's part of NATO. But here's the consequence: if we move with sanctions and pass them, and the Congress passes them, the president will probably attempt a veto. But I think that veto will be overridden, which will then send a major signal to the Turks that the U.S. no longer has confidence in Turkey as a NATO member. And the reason why we had nuclear weapons in Turkey in the first place is to show confidence that the Turkey was part of the NATO structure and in a kumbaya moment and friendship. But if all that confidence goes away, that will then drive Turkey more toward Russia.
You know what's interesting about this is it was a bipartisan bill, both Republicans and Democrats pushing it, except in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you had Rand Paul, as expected, but also Ted Cruz, Mike Lee. You had some staunch conservatives saying this is a bad idea, a bad bill, especially if the White House is aligned with them. So I'm going, okay, who's pushing it? I look at their agenda. What do you think is going to be the immediate response of the United States if Turkey says, you know what, you want to act this way, you're out of our country?
Well, they will be disinvited. They're going to have to move out. Then they will move their bases to other locations that I pointed out earlier. Now, what's interesting is that when we took out Baghdadi, we didn't leave from from Incirlik. We left from a base in Iraq, which meant we had to cross all of Syria, which shows that already we're acting as though we're no longer relying on Incirlik all that much.
But that's where our nukes are housed. 50
but
nukes.
They can move them out.
But they can. But that's still going to be obviously. I don't think that can be smooth moving.
Then that's a show of lack of confidence, and that'll be another signal to Turkey. But I don't think that'll happen unless and until the legislation is passed. The president attempts to veto, but it's overridden. If it's overridden, then we're going to see some new fireworks.
Well, and that's what's kind of interesting in all of this, because you do have two members of NATO, and we just finished the meeting there. You would have think that maybe they could have brought some peace between this relationship and calmed things down. Obviously, nothing happened productive in this arena. Should there be an emergency meeting of NATO called if this route starts to go down?
Well, I think they're going to have a meeting and try to placate Turkey somehow, and I think the president, for his part, he can decide whether or not to implement sanctions as required. But, you know, there we go again. He can be impeached once again for not abiding by the law, the intent of Congress, and abuse of power. I mean, we can hear it all over again.
Well, let's talk about the reset of power within the Middle East, because obviously Turkey, having the United States in your corner is a very good thing. If it shows that Turkey doesn't, what does that do to the power structure and already the tension and the fighting that's going on?
We're already seeing a shift in the geostrategic alignment by the United States. It is moving more. It's investing much more now in Greece, in the Aegean and in the Mediterranean, away from reliance on Turkey, and more, and even looking to watch trying to keep the Russians out of the Balkans, out of the Mediterranean as much as possible, and that's what's going to force Turkey to gravitate more toward Now, if we move those toward Russia, if we move those nukes out, that then allows Turkey to consider bringing in more missiles from Russia. I mean, and then the Russians
growing their strength within the region,
within Turkey,
right, into that side of it.
And so this is going to really alter the balance of power in that region.
But ultimately, some are accusing Erdogan of basically trying to reinstitute the Ottoman Empire and consolidate kind of all that.
That's been going on for some time.
And so is that ultimately what his goal is? And does he accomplish that if he does allow another superpower, even though he's pushing the United States out, by allowing Russia to come in? All you're doing is basically saying, I'm still going to be the weaker one of this relationship.
Yeah, but his beef will be more with Saudi Arabia. He wants to be the chief spokesman for the Sunnis, and you can see his activities now toward Libya, even though it's against the Saudis. So he is trying to expand his influence. We see him in a base in Qatar now, and so he is trying to expand. Ultimately, I think that safe zone in Syria is ultimately going to become part of Turkey eventually, because that keeps a barrier with the Kurds, but at the same time, it's part of his notion of taking back what existed prior to the Ottoman in terms of what was Turkey.
Well, there's definitely some shifting sands of power right now.
Oh, tremendous.
And it's interesting to see that Congress actually is one of those that's possibly got the biggest shovel right now.
They're basically taking the president's ability to conduct foreign policy out of his hands, and they're running foreign policy, which is a major shift that's going to happen.
And it's scary because we are talking about ultimately nuclear bombs that are in limbo right now in this case. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Pleasure.
It's hard to clear through the debris and get right down to the nitty-gritty that is real news.
New details are coming to light in the case of Jeffrey Epstein as more
spread between the 2-year Treasury yield and the 10-year Treasury yield.
Several hundred students are staging a sit-in.
the Amazon rainforest, and the blame game is underway. It's time for RT America. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button.